In a Q&A section on the 5th volume of the manga, Hideaki Sorachi mentioned that he wanted to have a title with impact. And from that desire, he landed on the title Gintama. The kanji for Gintama reads as Gin, meaning silver, and Tama, meaning soul. This serves as a pun on Gintama, where the symbol for Gin is instead swapped out for Kin, meaning gold, and the kanji for Tama is switched out to the one meaning balls, Gintama, therefore golden balls, which can also be interpreted as testicles. Now, how did a title that's as risque as this made its way to the contents of Shonen Jump, a magazine that has adolescent boys as its target audience? One way of looking at it is that it's exactly why it made its way in. But without getting into too much details, there exists this notion that Japanese corporations have the tendency to refrain from taking excessive risks. Unless you're Rakuten. Which in this case may come from the PR nightmare of dealing with angry parents concerned about the materials their children are reading. And I mean, they might have a point here. The exact conversation that took place in Shueisha's headquarters are, needless to say, not made public. But somehow, the title still made its way to the final product, and the manga was still able to get serialized. In a nutshell, this is virtually a microcosm for Gintama's turbulent serialization process. Now, to get a better picture of how it all came to be, let's rewind the clock a bit. "2003 was a year. A year where Cristiano Ronaldo signed for Manchester United. A year where Arnold Schwarzenegger was elected governor of California. A year where Gintama made its debut on December 8th, which was published on the final issue of Shonen Jump for that year. A week prior to that, the hit sensation Death Note started serializing in the same magazine, and to further illustrate the landscape of Shonen Jump at the time, industry giants One Piece, Naruto, and Bleach were leading the fray, while other household names such as Hunter x Hunter, Yu-Gi-Oh!, and iShield 21 were busy making their own noise from within the magazine. The competition was fierce, and going up against notable works such as the one that were just mentioned here was already a feat on its own. This, of course, posed a great challenge for Hideaki Sorachi, the mangaka behind Gintama. Sorachi had previously already dabbled in the manga scene, publishing the one-shot Dandelion and Shirokuro. But to actually go on and eventually get serialized for what would be more than a decade in Shonen Jump of all places is something that probably even he would have never dreamed of. Not only did he have to figure out how to physically and mentally survive the absurdly ruthless work culture of being a weekly mangaka, he also had to figure out how to be relevant in a saturated market filled with the big boys. In order to get his name out there, he had to come up with a hook, something that could turn heads when mentioned. In a Q&A section in Volume 5 of Gintama, Sorachi stated that he originally came up with the title Yorozuya Ginsan, while his editor at the time, Kohei Onishi, suggested the title Silver Samurai. Both of these titles were immediately scrapped after Sorachi deemed them bland. Feeling that he wasn't getting anywhere, Sorachi decided to take some time off and go back to his parents' place for a change of pace. During that time, he set up a family meeting to discuss possible titles for the manga, and eventually, the Sorachis settled on the title Gintama. Upon hearing this, Onishi surprisingly met this with great enthusiasm, believing that it would be a title capable of immediately grabbing the reader's attention. Of course, the higher-ups in Shueisha weren't too happy about this. While the details of what exactly unfolded aren't made public, after his summon, Kohei Onishi was quoted to have said, "I got the people upstairs to shut up, so we'll go with Gintama, okay?" Very hard-boiled indeed. But of course, for Sorachi, that was only the tip of the iceberg. Another great challenge of being a Shonen Jump mangaka is how to consistently deliver content on a week-by-week basis. After all, being a manga author was his means to put food on the table. Every mangaka has their own game plan when facing this problem. For Sorachi, he wanted to create a setting which would not constrain any of his ideas. A setting that's not bound to any logic or rules. A setting where anything goes. In the first volume of Gintama, there's a section where Sorachi reveals to have originally wanted to make something that's Harry Potter-esque, where he would add his own spin to it with a Japanese twist. But his editor had other plans. In Japan, the NHK, which is their national broadcasting corporation, has this tradition of airing a year-long television series based on historical events, known as the Taiga drama, where every year, the story would focus on different periods of Japanese history. At this point in time, the topic for the 2004 Taiga drama was just recently revealed. The year-long TV series would go on to cover the Shinsengumi, a Japanese special police force from the Bakumatsu period. Since the Taiga drama has a proven track record of garnering a decent-sized viewership, Onishi's idea was to jump on the coattails of the Shinsengumi Taiga drama. This is essentially the exact opposite of what Sorachi had in mind. Following Onishi's plan meant that Gintama would be forced to be consistent with the general flow of history, and this would have really limited what sort of things Sorachi could introduce to the story. Not only that, but Sorachi had already attempted to do something with Japanese history in his one-shot Samuraider, which didn't even manage to take off into the world of publication. Sorachi's empirical counter-evidence, objection! In addition to his own ideals, would explain his hesitation to follow the plan that Onishi had already laid out. But somewhere along the way, Sorachi and Onishi somehow reached a compromise. Now, this is simply going to be my own headcanon, but I'd imagine their discussion to go something like, "I want to make something like Harry Potter. Nah, let's make something about Japanese history. But I want the freedom of fantasy. Well, why don't we combine the two? Samurai against monsters. Monsters versus aliens. Samurai against aliens. Bro! Oh God, what have I done?" By adding in sci-fi elements into a historically inspired setting, Sorachi would effectively still be able to ride the Shinsengumi wave, while still allowing his creative ideas to flow somewhat freely. As for the responsibilities of being faithful to history, this Q&A section on the 5th volume of Gintama should give you an idea of his attitude towards it. Now, with a concrete plan in mind, all that's left is to actually go on and soar the skies of serialization. In an interview found in the second official Gintama character book, it was revealed that the first chapter of Gintama didn't fare too well on the Shonen Jump readers' ranking poll. This period of time was excruciatingly overwhelming for Sorachi. In his words, "I didn't know my pace. I didn't know how to draw color pages. I didn't know how to use assistants, I had no friends, Tokyo is a really scary place, and so on and so forth. It really felt like sprinting in the dark. He admitted that his saving grace was his own naivety. At the time, he had yet to comprehend what data, such as the reader's ranking, meant, and as a result, he still held his head up high and moved on from his predicament, as if nothing happened. Ignorance is bliss, after all. A proposition that he couldn't really replicate later down the line. Foreshadowing. During Gintama's serialization, Sorachi was constantly confronted with the prospect of toning down his allegedly clumsy humor, since it would really encumber the workflow of his publishers. Despite this, he would go on to stick to his own ideals. Eventually, both Shueisha and the anime staff came to terms with his uncompromising attitude, and even took the necessary measures to still enable him to continue doing what he does. Of course, this would not come without its repercussions. In Japan, the Broadcasting Ethics and Program Improvement Organization, or the BPO for short, is a non-profit organization that deals with complaints and ethical issues by conducting investigations into problematic programs. There's an incident where the BPO was informed of the presence of a problematic show that was airing on the 6 p.m. time slot of national television. While it never was explicitly disclosed, it was widely understood that the show in question was Gintama. The notice mentioned depictions of pseudo-intercourse with a doll, along with S&M play, which coincides with the contents of episode 269 of the anime adaptation. The timing of it all also stayed consistent with this hypothesis. Another example of where Gintama managed to raise some eyebrows is when the reruns for an episode of the anime adaptation was cancelled at the request of TV Tokyo. Episode 232 was deemed problematic for its apparent depiction of Renho Murata, a Japanese politician who was a current member of the House of Councilors. You can also get a glimpse of the number of complaints the series received throughout just by simply reading the manga or watching the anime, as Gintama often pokes fun and makes references to such gripes. Despite all these setbacks, the manga would eventually go on to last for 704 chapters, or as Sorachi stylized, 704 lessons spread across 77 volumes, and managed to sell over an impressive 55 million physical copies. One of the most notable stumbling blocks the series had to face was in its ending. From a production standpoint, the process of how Gintama ended was chaotic, to say the least. In 2015, the editorial team at Shueisha communicated to Sorachi to wrap the story up soon. As a result, the manga team forwarded this message to the anime staff. No clear dates yet, but soon. The plan at this point was to have the manga and anime end at roughly the same time. But rather than ending the series as instructed, Sorachi instead introduced some profound narrative plot points that needed to be addressed, which prompted the series to be prolonged rather than ending. This was back in 2015. The manga itself only ended in 2019. Which of course meant that there were several false proclamations of ending along the way. To further complicate things, roughly 10 chapters before Gintama was slated to end its serialization, Sorachi was assigned a different editor. If there was any consolation to all of this, it would be that his new editor was none other than Takuma Naito, someone Sorachi had already previously worked with. The pressure of ending the series would continue to gnaw at Sorachi, but he was still adamant to end things in his own terms. This put Takuma Naito in the uncomfortable position of having to inform the higher-ups at Shueisha that it would be impossible to end the series as is, especially within the remaining allocated chapters. Eventually, it was decided that Gintama would move from Weekly Shonen Jump to its sister magazine, Jump Giga. presumably to grant Sorachi more flexibility. While being published there, Sorachi had a bit more leeway with his deadlines, as he didn't have to work on a constant 7 days time limit anymore. After publishing 3 chapters in Jump Giga, the series would again have to move publications, this time to the Gintama app for mobile. And after finishing 2 chapters in this new digital platform, Sorachi was finally ready to conclude his 15+ year long journey. His deadline for the final chapter was scheduled to be somewhere in June of 2019, to allow the final volume of the manga to be released a month later in July. But just like a university student crunching hours working on their final dissertation paper, the concept of deadline became something more akin to guidelines. And regrettably, Sorachi wasn't able to make it in time, which again would delay the ending of Gintama. Now switching gears a bit, there's this tradition in Shonen Jump for long serialized manga, where all the editors across the history of the series would get together and give flowers to the mangaka they all have worked with, as they come to collect the final manuscript. There's an amusing anecdote in the Gintama fanbook of how this tradition played out for Sorachi. Sometime close to the encroaching deadline, Sorachi informed his editor that he would get the final chapter done in 3 days, probably somewhere in the afternoon. That particular time window was difficult to work with for most of his past editors, and as such, most of them informed Naito that they wouldn't be able to make it. Fast forward to approximately the agreed upon time, Takuma Naito came knocking on Sorachi's door at around 11 AM. Evidently, Naito was slightly early, so Sorachi told him to wait out a bit and promised to get it done by 5 PM. Naito then replied to just get it done by 7. As a result of this delay, Sorachi's past editors were now able to make it instead, and went along for the meetup. And so comes 7 PM. This time, the editors have flocked together in front of Sorachi's humble abode to come congratulate him for finishing the series, only to be met back with, "Just 2 more hours." Sorachi then asked all his editors to go and have a drink somewhere in the meanwhile, much to their dismay. But that's still not the end of it. A couple minutes after the editors were out having a drink, Sorachi privately messaged Naito begging to grant him 1 last additional hour for safe measures. Seemingly out of choice, Naito reluctantly agreed to it, and eventually, Sorachi did manage to get the final manuscript done, albeit within 4 more additional hours. And thus conclude the serialization of Gintama. Now, at this stage of the video, let me indulge myself a bit and offer some of my personal sentiments. First of all, I would like to make clear that I don't personally know Hideaki Sorachi. I don't have any insider information. I am not a journalist. But I do know that he's someone who eats, poops, and sleeps like the rest of us. My intention for showcasing the mangaka Hideaki Sorachi was not to put him on a pedestal, nor convey how special he might be. But rather, I wanted to show that he is in fact a human, even though he may claim to be a gorilla. The only resources I have available to make this video are the Q&A sections in the official volumes of the manga, the fan-translated interviews, and the anime itself. But even so, it seems clear to me that Hideaki Sorachi is someone who's cognizant of the consequences for his own action. How submitting a manuscript late would greatly affect the life of his newlywed editor. How putting an excessive amount of dirty jokes would make the publishers come under fire. How not meeting deadlines meant delaying the release of the manga volumes, betraying the fans' expectation. There's a section on the fanbook which revealed Sorachi's apology to his editor for not being able to make his deadlines. And while it's consistent to how he usually conveys himself, in that he would try to make light out of things, To me, it sounded like a guy who was tired of letting people down. But what struck me even more was that it sounded like a guy who was tired of letting himself down. Now again, that's just my take on it. I don't know him as a person, like at all. But if I had the opportunity to say something to Sorachi, I would just like to congratulate him on finishing the Gintama series, and that I had enjoyed it quite a lot. I wish him good luck on his future endeavors, wherever it may be. And with that, folks, thank y'all for watching, and see you next time.